Hello students, good to talk to you even though I'm out of town this week. Hopefully this message via YouTube will allow you to rest your pens a little bit more than you normally do when you're in my class and I go rather quickly. What we'll do in this first segment is we'll actually introduce our topic here, explain this title, and I'll give you a principle as I always do by way of understanding the rest of the lesson. We only have 3 more of these actually before we present final projects. So I encourage you to continue working on those and have those ready for that date in May when they are finally due. You look at this title here, it is indicative and imperative. You should recognize this from grammar. Those of you who have taken Latin, especially Lingua Latina, should also recognize both of these terms. In grammar, quite simply, indicative has a very simple meaning. It just means what something is actually being done, the actual action that goes behind a certain verb. So for example, if you say, Daniel eats the apple, that is indicative. It's what he's actually doing. He's actually doing the action. Whereas imperative would be to command someone to do something, such as, Daniel, eat the apple. So it has a very simple difference in actual grammar, but it means much more when you actually break this apart theologically. And that's kind of the incredible thing about the way that God has made his world, is that it's not as if he's made his world separate from him or divorced from any reference point to him. In fact, he's actually put his reference, put himself in everything that he has done, not in a pantheistic sort of way, of course, but in the sense that you can find references to his actual character in everything that actually he has made. And of course, grammar is one of those things. He actually is the Word. But it's interesting, theologians use both of these terms to describe the action of God. Indicative is a term that they mean to describe what he is actually doing in us and in this world, which is also based upon what he has already done. Now, of course, we're talking about both past and present here, as if they're the same time, which for God they are essentially, because he's outside of time. But what I mean by indicative is that when we say that God does things indicatively, it means that what he does is a part of who he is. He just does them. He saves us. So therefore it is a reality. And it's not contingent upon us. It's entirely contingent upon him and upon his will. And his will happens simply because he is. Simply because he is the I am. What that follows then, or what follows that I should say, is this whole idea of imperative, the whole sense that because he is who he is, because he does not have his reference point, he doesn't have to refer to anyone else to do what he does, and because he's already saved us apart from ourselves, that means that then he commands us and we can actually fulfill those things, because when we worship, when we baptize, when we take communion, when we read the scriptures, we are simply affirming what he has already done in the indicative. In other words, our salvation is not dependent upon our actual good works. Now, with that as a background, you'll see that our topic here is the Great Reformation. And today the goal is to cover the 3 great reformers, with actually a bonus one thrown in, so to speak. We're going to take a look at Luther, Calvin, and Knox. But by way of a principle, of course, this is kind of the overall grid that I want you to think through. But I have 2 quotations for you to consider specifically by way of a principle. The first is from Proverbs. This is Proverbs 16:9. Proverbs 16:9 says that the heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. In other words, this is an excellent principle to view the Reformation through. Because in the Reformation, you have the entire story of the church. And the story of the church, you have the story of men who actually plan how they actually intend to act. Yet there's this continual reminder throughout the Christian life that while we are encouraged to follow God, while we are encouraged to actually pursue calling, while we are encouraged to pursue good works, while we actually come up with regular plans, and we're actually called to cast vision before us, there's this continual reminder throughout all of those things that even though we do that, he still establishes our steps, which is why, of course, when you make a plan, things don't necessarily go according to plan. In other words, it's a reference back to his actual indicative nature. It's a reference back to his actual sovereignty in the sense that he actually wills everything to happen. That was the heart and soul of the Reformation, was that essentially man could not be a co-redeemer with God. And simultaneously, because God had done all of the work, because he had done 100% of the work of salvation, including granting faith to us, we were not ourselves. In fact, that was one of Calvin's sayings. He said this over and over again, that we do not belong to ourselves. In fact, you can bring in the whole idea of the genitive case here. That whole sense that to be of something or to be possessed by something in terms of God actually possessing us as his own people, which is of course how you look at things covenantally throughout the scriptures, it all implies that we are not our own. Which leads me to the second quotation. This is another quotation by Calvin, who's kind of the central thinker of those three that I've given you in terms of those three great reformers. He said this. He said, "We do not find grace by liberty, but liberty by grace." In other words, it's not because he's given us freedom that we somehow stumble upon grace, that we somehow stumble into the kingdom. It's rather quite the opposite. It's the fact that he gives us grace, the fact that he actually wakes us up from being dead, and thus he gives us liberty. So therefore, when we do follow his commands, when we do follow his imperative orders, when we worship, when we read scriptures, when we do good works, when we pray, when we take communion and so forth, we are simply affirming what he has already done. That is the heart and soul of the Reformation. That is the heart and soul of all of the solas that I gave you last week. That is the heart and soul of what made these men actually go forward in their attempt to reform the church rather than to create a new type of church. With that as an introduction, in the next segment we'll take a look at Martin Luther.